Thank you, Renu. Thank you so much. Before we jump into the discussion, I must tell you that on stage today we have boatloads of wisdom, and these three authors have done some phenomenal work. For example, Nilesh's book on Rama and his footsteps is a book that every one of you will love to read because it actually takes you to the history of mythology. Very interesting. Dhanushri has written across multiple genres, right from short stories on ghosts, which are like absolutely brilliant, to mythology come historical fiction in the form of Ambapali, to her books on inspiring books rather on women in armed forces, including the famous one that is converted into a web series now, and her work on mystery as well. And Satyarth, whose latest book is actually a treasure trove of stories from our mythology. Mahagata is a real thick book but lovely one. So we have boatloads of wisdom on the topic we're discussing. Given this background, I'll straight away jump into my first question and I'll start with Satyarth you. Why do you think right now India is obsessed with mythology and historical fiction?
Hi, wonderful to be here. Thank you, Dipankar. I think India has always been obsessed with mythology because we have such a rich tradition of mythology. The culture of mytho comes down from thousands of years. The kind of text that we have, whether it's the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, I mean, just the sheer variety. So I think we've always been a nation that has wanted to examine these texts, read these texts, and glean as much wisdom from these texts. But I think over the years, definitely mytho as a genre has picked up in a really big way. I think for me, I think one reason, probably the way I see it, is that initially what happened in the generation of our parents and grandparents, there were bigger families, and there was always a storyteller, an elder or a grandparent who was there to pass down stories to the younger generation. Today, with nuclear families and families splitting up, that one storyteller is missing in almost every family. So you are looking at authors who can tell you those stories. So youngsters are looking at these kind of books where they'll find these stories and their roots. Like I say on every platform, Devdutt has become the national grandfather where he's telling us all the stories that we need to know.
You wouldn't like it, huh? You wouldn't like being called a grandfather.
So as so many authors. So I think that is the need to reconnect with your past. And of course, like I said, to glean the wisdom from the past and to just basically acquaint yourself with your roots. That I think is a big reason why mytho has become what it is.
Excellent. Dhanushri, you've done a lot of historical fiction as well. Historical fiction not going back thousands of years, going back as late as about maybe 50, 60 years also. So India is also obsessed with history. Why do you think history also plays a role, and how does fiction come into that play?
I think history is very important because it connects us to the past, and culturally as we move forward, we lose connections with our roots if there is no bridge. And I think the bridge comes in form of the historical books. And much of what we know keeps changing. It's a dynamic process. Like for instance, what history was to us, say about 30 years back, now the whole dynamic route that it has taken, we find a lot of changes. Now people are saying that was written by the British historians, and we need to examine the history from our point of view and from the Indian perspective, and we have not had too many historians writing about stuff. So what has happened is that these historical books, somehow they teach us a lot of lessons, and of course it keeps changing. And I love to write historicals because I identify with them. And I think it is important to put it in a raw form and mold it into an interesting book. So that is where it becomes a fiction.
Very interesting aspect on that. Nilesh.
I have something to add on this
Yes.
before you fire me the question, which is that the breaking up of families is what you talked about, and all these other influences with which we are continuously bombarded. I think what's happening is that we are becoming more and more rootless. We are floating around from one place to the other. And the more rootless you are, the more you look for roots. I think that is probably one reason why we are all going back to mythology, and why mythology is connecting so much with us. Because there is this search for a sense of identity. What are we really? For answering that question, I think all of us need to go back to mythology, because it is mythology which has shaped us into what we are.
Nilesh, I have a very difficult question to begin with, which is out of syllabus for you. As a believer in science, I always thought Ramayana is mythology. Okay? And when I read your book, I realized that there is a possibility of Ramayana actually being history. What is your verdict on that? Is Ramayana mythology or history?
I am blessed by the fact that a lot of people who thought of this question thought they were inventing it. But it's been done to death with me before, so I can answer this very confidently. Yes, all mythology, I think, has its roots somewhere in history. So there has to have been a story like this, like the Ramayana, which subsequently got blown out of proportion. And people kept adding layers to it in order to make it more relevant to their times and to their situation. And because they kept adding layers to it, it became more and more complex, and more, it got built up into the level of fantasy. But there has to be a story. There's a reason, I would say. If you go back to recorded evidence, then as early as, I think it's probably 500 CE, you have stone tablets, you have temple carvings, you have a recorded thing, you have coins on which Ram, Sita and Lakshman are put down. Now, this is consistently across the country. It is not as if Ram, Sita and Lakshman are revered in one part of the country alone. They are revered across the nation. The story with minor modifications has stayed the same. So if a particular story was able to hold its own throughout the country, across the expanse, when there were no means of communication like we have now, there has to be a solid core to it in the first place. So I think there is a core to the story. And if you go back to the beginning of the Valmiki Ramayana, when Narad met Valmiki and Narad talked to him and said, Valmiki, he gave him the indications of what an ideal man should be. And Valmiki said, "Aisa koi hai kya?" So he said, "Ha, Ayodhya ka Rajkumar Ram, ya Ayodhya ke Raja Ram." So there was a person there. So it started as that story, but that story kept expanding, and as it kept expanding, it became more and more fabulous, more and more larger than life, and now we look at it as mythology, which is probably not correct.
Okay, the verdict is it's not really mythology, there is historical evidence to it. We'll come to you back for more on that. Satyarth, you've written a magnum opus with your stories from Mahapurans, right? We know that the entire concept of Puranas is a very complex, with multiple versions, multiple books. There's Shiv Puran, there's Vishnu Puran, and there are multiple other Purans, right? How did you go about researching, and are these texts really available for anybody to go and check them out?
Yeah, currently, thankfully, there are many of these Puranas that are available in English translations that you can read. That was also my source, because I can't read Sanskrit, so I did not really go and read the Sanskrit editions. I had to rely on the English translations, and a lot of the Mahapuran especially have been translated. So there are 36 Puranas in total. There are 18 Mahapurans and 18 Upapurans. The Mahapurans have been translated, almost all of them. So definitely there's a resource that if anyone is interested. It was of course a daunting task. It took me 5 years to write Mahagatha. But you know, the process itself was so joyous, because it was about delving into, I've always grown up loving mythology. I remember my grandfather was a huge influence, and sitting on his lap, for me it was a process of osmosis, just listening to those stories and, you know, getting that wisdom from him. So then I grew up, the idea was, how do I wanted to explore more and find out if there are any more stories that I don't know about. And when I entered the universe of the Puranas, it was staggering. There was so much that one did not know about, so many stories and characters. So I was like, why don't we put the best of what it is under one roof? That is how the germ of Mahagatha began. So today, the success of the book is also because of the fact that, like, we had Ayan Mukherjee launching the book in Bombay. And he said, you know, Satyarth, for me, what is wonderful about Mahagatha is that it has given me an access to the Puranas. Something that I might not, because I'm not an academic, I would not go and read a Shiv Puran or a Vishnu Puran. But through Mahagatha, I can now enter that world, and what better madhyam than stories to enter a world like that. So that is what.
Excellent. Tanushree, coming to you, you've written a book which is Ambapali. Okay. many would say, or many would rather argue that it is historical fiction, many would argue it's mythological fiction. The whole world always debates. Where do you draw the line between history and mythology? And how do you go about doing it?
See, if you see the definition of mythology, it still is explained as something which cannot be verified. But if you see the definition of history, it is something which is verifiable. And Ambapali definitely strode the line between the two, because she is mentioned in the Buddhist tomes. She was a Buddhist nun, the Buddha's disciple, and it is mentioned in the Buddhist tomes. Similarly, even in the Jaina tomes also she is there, and the Amrapali one is there. We have evidence of that, and we have evidence of her existence through the verses that she recited or composed. In those days, there was something known as Therigatha, which is the book of the elder nuns. The elder nuns, that is the Buddhist nuns of the absolute beginning, they had composed lots of verses, and Ambapali's verses are there. In fact, in my book, I have got the translation which I acquired with great difficulty. And so I would say that she is a very verifiable person who existed in a very, era when there was not much written about historically. So that is why it makes research all the more difficult, because we are talking about 500 BC. And that was a time when Mahavir, Buddha and Ambapali coexisted rather, in almost the same region.
So that's very interesting, and I'll take her point and ask a similar question to you. History and mythology is always a debate of your version versus my version, your interpretation versus mine. Even in Ramayana, we know there are umpteen number of versions, and the latest one being Tulsidasa's Ramayana, which has got new additions to it as well. Whose version did you follow, and did you find it difficult to trace the journey? For the audience, he's actually traced Ram's journey from Ayodhya to Lanka and back with physical evidences. So whose version did you follow to get them?
See, the beauty of the story is that it is accepted all over the country. The core of the story is accepted all over the country, but in order to make it more relevant for local conditions, local stories have been adapted and added onto it. Therefore, every part of the country that you go to will claim there is a Sita Rasoi there, because Sita ji cooked. There is also a place where they stayed. These stories will continue to emerge, because without these stories, the whole epic could not have been relevant to that particular part of the country. So for instance, on the way from Ayodhya to Nasik, Odisha claims that they stayed here.
And now Sita Rasoi there in Odisha also.
There's a Sita Rasoi, that's what I said. So Odisha claims it is there. Whereas if you actually took the path which logically they should have been following, it made no sense for them to go to Odisha and then come down to Dandakaranya and move on. So therefore, these stories are adaptations. So the versions are basically reflecting the love of the people for the theme and the desire of the reinterpreter to interpret the story in terms which the local people will be able to relate to. Therefore, if you ask a question like, कौन था राम? अरे वही तो जिसका वहाँ मंदिर है. वहाँ पर सीता जी रुकी थी. So that is what makes it relevant. So therefore, there are many versions, and as per the standard article by Ramanujam, which is referred to on this topic, there are some 332 written Ramayans. And if you actually go into all the oral versions, all the puppet shows, all the theatre, all the parts of the Ramayana that is there in the Puranas, you will find that there are well over 3,000. Now, nobody could possibly chart a linear course on a book on the basis of 3,300 different versions. So for that purpose, I think we took the local Ramayana. See, Tulsi Ramayana is what you will hear when you go to Chitrakoot and Ayodhya.
Correct.
As you move to Maharashtra, it is the Mahabharata Ramayana. As you move down south, it is Kamband Ramayana. So we continue to take the local Ramayana as the reference point and use that to chart a linear course.
Okay.
So trying to create a linear course out of something which exists at 3,300 levels is rather difficult.
Absolutely.
But at some point of time you have to do that, because otherwise there wouldn't be a book in it.
Great. Now Satya, I'm going to take you back to your first book, right, which is more about historical fiction, and that too mystery, history mystery. That's a very interesting plot that you picked up, and I think after you, multiple people have done the same thing, which is the entire story of 9. Okay. How did you come about finding about the whole idea of 9, and if you could elaborate on that, what were Ashoka's 9? to the audience.
So Ashoka's Nine is supposed to be the world's oldest secret brotherhood. So if you read Dan Brown and he convinces you that that is somewhere in Europe, no, India has the world's oldest secret brotherhood, the oldest secret cult. So that was fascinating for me. How the book happened, I call my first book A Freak Act of Nature, because I never planned writing that book. I had just finished reading, I think, Angels and Demons, and I was Googling, is there something interesting, esoteric in our own culture, in our own history? And some obscure website and this thing pops up, The 9 Unknown Men of Ashoka. I'm like, okay, hold on, what is this? And then when I read it, the amount of detailing that was available. So the idea, the concept basically says that Ashoka, after the Kalinga War, we all know that he had a change of heart, he became a Buddhist monk. The story, history books end there, but the esoteric ones go a step further and they say that once he had a change of heart, he vowed that he would not let that kind of violence ever happen on earth again. And for that, he thought it was important and very prudent to conceal 9 sciences which could be misused in the most terrible way possible. So these 9 sciences were hidden and they were given to one person each. So there were 9 people in charge of these 9 sciences. These were the 9 unknown men, and their job was to keep developing those sciences over the years without letting them fall in the wrong hands. So that was the idea behind the cult of Ashoka, and that is the basis of my first book. So like I said, I just found it by by a stroke of luck, and I said, this is a story that is waiting to be told. I mean, forget Dan Brown. We should be the ones talking about our country and the kind of stuff we have. So that's how the book happened.
You told the entire story but forgot mentioning the name of the book.
Achha, it's called The Emperor's Riddles.
Okay, coming to you, Tanushree, on something very interesting. You've written about Mughal history, okay, Escape from Harem, and the ones Noor Jahan's daughter, right? Mughal history is fairly well known and well documented as well. And yet you've managed to bring out intrigues and elements of history which people probably didn't know earlier. How did you go about finding those gaps in documented history which you converted into your stories?
See, like I said, history is very dynamic. If I were to write Ramayana today, I would paint Ram in a maybe not so favorable manner, because women are writing, rewriting, and they are talking about some parts which were, he was not infallible. So similarly, when you write history, there are gaps, and many times you come across some substantiating, references, and you can base your story on those. But at times you just have to work out how and what could have been possible. And then you piece together, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You piece together the different pieces available to you. And one tiny piece that is not available is filled up by your creativity. So if you see Ambapali, her story is not well documented. What you find, even I found that while researching that the Buddhist and the Jainese tomes, they differed regarding the names, the references, the origins. There were differences. So you just have to choose one, and you decide to stick with that and fill up the gaps through the available resources, and some through imagination naturally. So I did the same. But as far as Mughal history is concerned, I think everything is available. There's not much that is not known, unknown. So I didn't have so much difficulty there. A little build-up, of course, is always required when you write historical fiction.
Great. I'll come back to these two books a little later. Nilesh, back to you on this interesting question that I had in mind. We are all very well versed about what happened in Ramayana in India. And we were always very curious about what's there in Sri Lanka to support Ramayana. I believe you went to Sri Lanka as well to check those places out. Could you throw some light on that?
Actually, if you honestly ask me, there is not much in Sri Lanka. There are places which are called Ravana's cave. There is a place called Ravana's cut where he tried to cut a mountain into two to carry the Shiva temple to his mother who was ailing. There are such things are there. But primarily most of what was then Sri Lanka is now underwater. So what you are left with is only 10% of the Sri Lanka that was there then. Because if you recollect that story about Hanuman jumping 100 yojans to go to Sri Lanka. Now 100 yojans roughly translates into 800 miles. What is now available is only 24 kilometers. So it couldn't have been the same Sri Lanka. So that Sri Lanka actually extended much outwards. And there is some historical evidence for that. Because as far away as 5 kilometers from the coast, they have found cities under the water. So obviously Sri Lanka stretched out to much more than where it is now. So a bulk of the evidence has been washed away in the part that has got submerged. There are also people who theorize that Sri Lanka is not the Sri Lanka we know of now, it's probably Madagascar. Because it kind of tallies with the distances that are there. But there are as many theories as there are people. So you kind of learn to stick to one and go on with that. But Sri Lanka, yes, we have seen Ravana's cave, which is in a place called Ela, where you go up. See, we discovered a very new thing, which probably a lot of people don't know here, which is that just as we have highways today for connecting cities, in the times of Ravan, there were tunnels. There were tunnels bored into mountainsides, which connected cities between them. And armies moved through those tunnels from one city to the other. And we have seen some of them. I have been in one such cave and a tunnel system over there. So these have actually existed. Now at the edge of the tunnel, like we have malls, etc., at the edge of the highway, they had palaces. So at the edge of one such lengthy tunnel, there is this cave which is called Ravana's cave, which has cave paintings on top, some 20 meters above. And those cave paintings are dated to about 3,500 years back. So obviously that is a proof of the fact that people did live in such caves, did live that many years back, whether it was Ravan or somebody else, anybody's guess.
That's very interesting, and it's very fascinating to know that the stories that we've always thought are in the realm of mythology are now beginning to come true. As a matter of fact, the discovery of a chariot in Sinoli has actually opened up realms for possible reality check on Mahabharata as well, as you all know. Coming to you, Satyarth, on your research on Purans. So there are multiple versions of Puran, right? How did you reconcile which version is real, what to consider, and stories also differ between multiple versions, right? So how did you go about doing it? And also, did you really see those original texts somewhere?
So that is true. In fact, if you read the Puranas, the most fascinating and equally baffling thing about them is the fact that one story will have multiple versions across multiple Puranas. For example, every Purana will always begin with the concept of creation. That is always the first chapter. Cosmogony is the first chapter of every Purana. And those Puranas that are dedicated to Vishnu, they will say that Vishnu created the universe. Those dedicated to Shiva will say Mahadev created the universe, and those dedicated to Brahma. So there's no one single narrative in the Puranas, and that anyways has always been the beauty of Hindu culture and Hindu thought, that we do not have a single narrative. We've always believed in plurality of stories and truths and narratives. I mean, one basic difference, if you look at Semitic religions, whether it's Islam or Christianity, and this is not a value judgment saying one is superior to the other, but if you see whether it's Quran or the Bible, is generally interpreted in one single way, which is what you're supposed to adhere to. But Hinduism believes in constantly, exploring, re-exploring, and as many interpretations that there can be. Which is why a Devrat can write a My Gita, because that is his interpretation of the Gita, and I can have my own interpretation of the Gita. So that was wonderful about the Purans. So today in the country, when we are being told that there is one grand Hindu narrative that we all need to follow, I'm sorry, the ancient texts do not agree with that. It is always about questioning. Hindu spirit is always about questioning. If you look at even at the end of the Gita, after Krishna gives all the wisdom to Arjun, he asks him at the end, now what will you choose? So it is not him as a god imposing his will, but asking the person about individual choice. It has always been about that. So I think, it was baffling, but since Mahabharata was about creating a structure and a narrative about these stories, I did follow a single narrative, because that is the only way you can write a book, otherwise it can get pretty confusing. So if you read my author's note at the beginning of Mahabharata, I very clearly say that what you have here is only one version out of multiple versions available in the Puranas. So that is how the book went. But what was fascinating was to see the kind of karmic connections that are there in the stories. So if you see Mahabharata, Puranas, the concept of time is cyclical. So everything is connected to one another. So while as a child, if I would know a story and you would think that is probably a standalone tale. But when you read Mahabharata, you read the Puranas, you'll find everything is connected to each other. There are stories in the Treta Yuga, in the Satya Yuga, and they all affect each other. I'm going to give a very short example. We all know about Devaki and how Devaki, 6 sons of Devaki were killed before her eyes by Kans. But in Treta Yuga, way before that, there were two sisters, Aditi and Diti. And Aditi's son was Indra, and Diti's son were the Daityas. Now, because the Daityas were dying by the hands of Indra, so Diti comes and asks her husband Kashyap that I need a son who can kill Indra. So Kashyap gives her the boon, and he says, if you observe 10,000 years of cleanliness, you will get a son who will kill Indra. Diti goes ahead and she does that, but the last 3 days that are about to remain, and Indra is observing her from above, wondering what will happen. On the last day, unfortunately, Diti forgets to wash her feet before going to sleep. So her body becomes vulnerable. Indra enters her womb and destroys the fetus. Because of that happens, Diti curses Aditi that you were also a mother and you allowed your son to kill my son. I curse you that you will be born in one yuga where your sons will die before your eyes and you will stand and watch them helplessly. So Aditi is actually born as Devaki in Dwapar Yuga. So these connections, when you realize there's so much interconnection happening. So what Mahabharata does is give you a more holistic picture. You are able to connect the dots. It zooms out and gives you a more 3D version of the Puranas, which is what I think is what the readers are loving about the book.
Absolutely brilliant, Satyat, on that. You want to add something or? Yeah, please.
See, again, when you take into account different versions of the Puranas, see, they are not stories as such. They are meant to illustrate deeper truths. So therefore, you could see the truth from one angle, you could see it from another angle. So for each angle, you will have a story. So you have to draw your own conclusions. This whole issue of reinterpretation versus manipulation. Reinterpretation is at the core of Hinduism. Unless you interpret a particular text in the way you want, it doesn't become relevant to you. Therefore, reinterpretation is all there. There's just one fact, your sharp wali jo aapne baat kahi na, usse this thought process came in, which is that there are different versions of Puranas in which different kinds of stories are put in. One thing is constant. A shrap once given cannot be undone. So if you actually curse, even Vishnu cannot undo he can give a boon, but he cannot undo a shrap. I think the deeper truth for us then is that a word spoken in anger cannot be taken back and does incalculable harm. Now such truths are there which are hidden in the Puranas.
And if I could
we need to look at the basic truth rather than the superficial elements.
And just to add to, since you talked about curses and boons here, what is again fascinating about the Puranas is the boons actually end up doing harm and the curses end up actually doing good. So that also, that dichotomy is that paradox is very interesting. You will see Vishnu ki Dash avatar happened because of a curse. And so he comes down to the earth and does good. Well, a lot of the boons end up becoming actually, doing a lot more evil. So that paradox is very fascinating.
They are given to Daityas very often, and therefore they end up doing more harm than benefit.
Okay, coming to you on the Mughal history part. Okay, for both your books, you've picked up a very particular part of history, and you've picked up women as your major characters. Why would you do that? And second, in most of the North Indian forts, it is very easy to so-called go and look for a harem or what would have been a harem, and then end up realizing that those harems are one of the most complicated parts of the fort. What is your view on that?
See, I like to pick unusual characters because I feel they deserve their space in history. So in Noor Jahan's Daughter, I talked about, it's about Ladli Begum, who is hardly known. I mean, I don't think if you say Ladli Begum, anyone knows that she was such a powerful woman's daughter. What was she like? And, that curiosity led me to write Noor Jahan's Daughter. And of course, because Ladli was a very meek character, so Noor Jahan comes up as a very overpowering personality in most historical books, and So what happened is that I had to create, like you said, narratives, the fiction, the gaps, and they were all there. So I chose to, narrate the story through the eyes of her nurse at some parts, because the nurse was a witness to the entire lot of string of events. So that was one, and I did feel that she deserved this kind of a story. And secondly, about when I was researching, I came across so many details about a harem, how it was run. It was such a well-administered part of the entire empire. It was like an empire within the empire, where the women, they had accountants, they had everything. who maintained the regular journals and maintained the, day-to-day activities within the harem. The security system, for instance, it was really, really tight. We can compare that to any of the country's security systems, because they didn't want an imam to enter the harem unless he was approved. The entire system was a very well coordinated, administered thing. So when I did all that research, I realized there's another book in it. And that's how I wrote Escape from Harem. And in that, it's a girl who is taken to, satisfy the lust of Jahangir when he's frustrated after Noor Jahan's refusal. So this girl is just 15 years old, and she's picked up from the house and taken to him. And then she is consigned to a corner of the harem because she's one of those, nothing remarkable about her. And she goes on to, narrate this history about Jahangir and then his son who rebels, Shah Jahan. And so I follow the path like he has done Ramayana. This is about the narrative about the son revolting and this girl being a witness to it all until she dies, and she has seen the making of Taj Mahal. So that's how I narrated this story.
Very interesting. Before we go to the audience for questions, my last question to you in relation to this. While tracing the entire path of Ram, which is that part which you are now absolutely sure was in the original in the same form? Or rather, highest probability of being as is?
Probably a piece of rock in Sri Lanka. Now this is, you are all aware of the fact that Hanuman came to Dronagiri, and because he was looking for the Sanjeevani booty, he broke away a part of the mountain and carried it with him to Sri Lanka. And then the Vaidyas there took out the booty and gave it to Lakshman. Now, right next to Gale, there is a particular place where there is a kind of small hill, small mount, which has exactly the same shape as is the piece broken away from Dronagiri in Uttaranchal. Dronagiri is just above Oli, which is the ski resort. And you can see that Dronagiri mountain from there with that slight piece broken out. Now that piece is available in Sri Lanka, and the vegetation on that particular hillock is exactly the same, and the kind of mud and rock are exactly the same as in the Himalayas.
With scientific evidence? Scientifically proved that they are same?
Absolutely, that there are not just soil analysis. Those plants are medicinal plants, and the traditional Sri Lankan healers go there to collect those medicinal plants to make their own medicines. So that's probably the only place, and those are only found in the Himalayas, nowhere else in the country except there.
Absolutely
that is probably the most solid piece of evidence that we have ever seen for the fact that this story actually happened. We came closest to it.
Absolutely phenomenal.
So it was not Madagascar, it was Sri Lanka after all.
It was probably, yes, but then like in everything else to do with mythology, it is always a probably yes, never a yes for sure.
Great. On that note, I'll open it up for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question. You have a question, or you're raising your hand to show?
I have many questions, but let others have it.
Okay.
If nobody is there, I will ask. Nobody?
Yeah, okay.
Because it's not good for me to take chance every time.
Yes.
Some privileges go with the...
I know, but I don't want to misuse them. But I believe so many people are here, they would have something in mind. See, history, fiction and historical fiction, three are all my most favorite topics. I love them. I could not attend it from the beginning, but whatever I could gather, and I have 1,000 questions in my mind. Maybe privately we sit over a cup of coffee and we'll discuss that if I get a chance. But at least one or two questions that come to my mind. Let me choose. Give me a minute. Firstly, when we talk about historical personalities or characters, sometimes we have read that it was not one person. They were different persons by the same name. Like Parshuram. He was not one Parshuram. There were multiple Parshurams in multiple ages. And we put all these stories together and think that it is part of one life, which sometimes is beyond imagination. That's one. Then what do you, as a historian or a historical fiction writer, do? Yeah. Okay, that's all I think. Maybe other questions sometime, some other time.
Yeah. There are always traditions of people. For instance, the Valmiki Ramayana is not written by Valmiki alone. There was no one person called Valmiki. It was a tradition called Valmiki who all kept adding to the Ramayana. Now, this is something that has been proven by linguistic experts, that the kind of verse that is used and the kind of language that is used has actually evolved through the Ramayana. So there are portions which are part of the original Ramayana, there are portions which have been written later. So this whole concept of the Valmiki Ramayana is something like written over maybe roughly 500 to 1000 years. So there are always traditions of people who are writing certain things. So likewise, it must be true of the Ramayana and other things also. Yes.
Hi, thank you for such an insightful panel. So I had a question. As writers who are writing for an audience who is so protective of their stories, their history, their mythology, how do you decide how far you want to push your fiction? You know, how far you want to take it from reality, or how much you want to stick to the fact and the reality that you've researched and studied?
See, as a writer, you have the onus of being truthful. At least that's how I believe my role to be. So I would rather stick to the authenticity. And I know there's a lot of change happening in the society today. There's a lot of intolerance towards certain things, and we are getting more and more intolerant about historical facts. So, but like for instance, the latest book that I have written, Thorns in the Crown. In this, it is about a Bengali revolutionary who goes to Burma to join INA, Subhash Chandra Bose. Now, when he goes there, he comes back very frustrated. He runs away from there, in fact. He escapes because he finds that what he was told is not exactly the truth. And my research I found that the Japanese people, the army, was mistreating the Indian soldiers, and they were really given very bad treatment. They were not given arms. They were made to do menial jobs. And so this boy, or rather man, he gets very frustrated and he comes back. Now, if you see today's intolerant world, I'm sure every Bengali is going to revolt about that, saying, no, it is not possible. But that is the truth. So I have chosen, I did spend a little time wondering whether I should write about that part, but then I chose to tell the story the way it was.
I think if people are sensitive about history, today they're hypersensitive about mythology, so it's all the more difficult as a mytho writer too. But I do agree, even while I was writing Mahabharata and putting those stories together, there were times when I did have to self-censor myself. Because, which is such a sad and unfortunate thing, because if something is existing in our Purans, the fact that we have to dilute it and present it in a way that probably would be more palatable to today's society, I mean, that cannot be a greater disservice to the writing and the literature that we have in ancient India. You know, the fact that, I mean, again, to give an example, we know about Vishnu's Mohini avatar, that he had taken the ravishing Mohini avatar. So there is a story that goes that Shiva, when he saw Mohini, he was so filled with lust that he and Mohini actually, they actually sleep together, and Ayappa, who is a South Indian deity, is supposed to be their son. Now that is there in the Purans, but when I wrote that story in Mahabharata, all you'll find is a chaste embrace between Shiva and Vishnu, because I did not want to push the envelope. So it is sad that, we have to take, like I said, Hinduism has always been such an open religion, and these things have always been talked about, in such, and have been analyzed and explored. So, but yes, today there is a certain amount of, like she said, intolerance, and so we have to, there are certain things that we do as writers have to be a little more careful about, unfortunately.
There are also many authentic versions to the same truth. There's again, it's very naive to think that there's only one truth. There are so many parallel truths running at the same time. So I think what you need to be sure is that there is at least one version of the truth which you have actually explored before writing it down. So, for instance, in you've all heard about a brief story. We have that counter says. We have all seen the Ramanand Sagar Ramayana, in which Ravan steps into the Lakshman Rekha and the fire bursts out and he has to force Sita to come out and then he abducts her. This is not there in Valmiki and Tulsidas at all. This came in much later, in about 1500 something, in a Telugu Ramayana, went to the Bangla Ramayana, and then came into the common narrative in Uttar Pradesh in the Ram Leelas. Now, if I, for instance, say that there is no Lakshman Rekha ever drawn, am I or am I not speaking the truth? At one level, I am, because Valmiki doesn't mention it, Tulsidas doesn't mention it, none of the Ramayans of the older times mention it. At another level, I am not, because that's what you believe. So that's a very difficult line to tread. But I have to be sure about what I am writing, that there is an authenticity in what I have written, and I am able to substantiate it in argument whenever a question is asked of me. So if I am sure, I can take whatever version of the truth I want and ensure that that's written about.
The only caveat over here, as a publisher, I believe, is that on one side, it is our moral responsibility to bring out all versions of truth. It is also important for us to be sensitive enough to somebody else's belief system and try and circumnavigate those elements, not to hurt. Our idea is to spread knowledge and bring out all versions of truth, but not to create hurt in other people. However, unfortunately, what will hurt people today is something which is very difficult to be commented upon.
And also it is what sells books more. Sometimes publishers are happy to take such controversial statements into their book so that the book sells more, but that's not done. Because if a book does more harm than good, if one part of the book continues to be discussed to the exclusion of the rest of it, then I think the book is not doing a good job. So it is in the interest of the book that we must compromise on certain things and speak half-truths or call a conception as occurring through a chaste embrace.
Absolutely. One last question from the gentleman over here. Yeah, absolutely.
More than a question, just to add on. Between the Valmiki Ramayana and Ramcharitmanas, there are many authors who have written local versions, and especially the Telugu one that you mentioned about the Lakshman Rekha is actually written by a lady author, one of the very rare lady authors who wrote the Ramayana before Ramcharitmanas, and she was a potter's daughter, and she was prohibited from writing, and she was stopped from entering the Ram temple, and she was denied every opportunity to write, and she came up with these perceptions of what would have happened in the Ramayana by meditating upon Ram. Even when I am saying this, I can get the goosebumps, and that's a very powerful Ramayana. And subsequently 5 different authors took that version and created a larger school of Ramayana in Telugu and Odisha versions, and that is indeed a very significant variation from Valmiki Ramayana and Ramcharitmanas.
On that note, we are out of time. It was lovely having all of you panelists over here. I'd request all the audience to go to the bookstore, pick up their books, don't miss out. It's, as I said, boatloads of wisdom and exciting and intrigue-based stories available. So get the books, get them signed, and you have your day. Over to you, Renu.